During a single early morning once a year, volunteers fan out across the Memphis area to count the number of people who are homeless. In 2019, that citywide search came up with an astonishing number, 1,300 people. Each of these people have their own stories, and the number of these stories are increasing.
I've been homeless going on 5 years.
I've been homeless for 10 years.
78% of people experiencing homelessness in America in 2019 were African American. This number of 78% did not happen by chance. It happened because the system is rigged. It is not about lack of effort. It is not about lack of concern. It's not about lack of drive. It's about options being so limited.
I've been out here for 5 weeks. Everywhere is overcrowded and there is nowhere for me to go.
It's all connected to generational poverty and systemic racism and white supremacy. It's all connected.
Here we are, the richest, most powerful nation in the world with a growing homeless population. Should not happen.
The majority of the people in Memphis want to do something about this. They want to make a difference.
Good afternoon, this is Miss Young calling from MIFA, and I was calling in regards to a referral that we received for the Rapid Rehousing Program. The ultimate goal for MIFA's Rapid Rehousing Program is move families from homelessness into permanent housing. We work with the client as far as employment, if that's one of their goals, utility assistance, and also we could offer additional month's rent. Everybody deserves a stable home and stable environment, and MIFA is here to offer that.
I was working. I ended up getting laid off because of getting sick and just fell short. It was about a week and a half. I just was in the car. My cousin was telling me about MIFA, so I put the application in online and they actually contacted me the same exact day. At that moment I knew they were gonna help us. In the midst of me getting my permanent address, I started seeking new employment. I'm starting my new job today.
We very often get calls from MIFA staff saying that they have parents with children who are unsheltered and need a place to stay during the night. Understanding that our model for shelter, different congregation, different host site a night, is not ideal for children. And so we began to explore the possibilities to offer a permanent emergency shelter.
When I heard the opportunity to partner with Room in the Inn Homeless Ministry, I got excited. We'll be able to provide the shelter and the medical care that this growing population needs here. I'm so thankful for what they will see, a renovated facility, first-class rooms, first-class bathrooms, first-class beds and equipment.
We can put a single bed for a parent and bunk beds for our children easily in these rooms. And then this hallway, this area will be the family area.
It don't look like much now, but wait and see. It's gonna be our courtyard. We all looking for something to have hope for. And so with this facility, putting the homeless people back into society, letting them know that they are somebody that need to be lifted up and that they can go out and help the next victim. No, let them know where they can come get them some resources. It's gonna be one great day.
The ultimate goal for us is to see people have a real fighting chance at life. We'll get started again. The video was excellent, not just because I was in there.
Okay, can everybody hear me?
You're a little low, Kim.
Okay, we have to get a little closer. All right, I apologize for the technical difficulties, but we're in here. So that was an awesome video. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. And we have an excellent discussion that's going to be started on this morning. And so just to introduce this segment that we're going to be discussing today, it is what eviction and homelessness does to our community. As many of you are very aware, if you just go by in some of the neighborhoods and you drive by and you see a lot of people with their items, their personal belongings sitting out in front of various apartments and homes, etc. And it's hard, it's tough to be able to see that. And that happens in more communities than we would love to see. So what this event tried to get to and to address a lot of the issues that are associated with evictions and homelessness, and possibly coming up with some solutions on how we can address those things. And so we have a great panel on today, and you just heard from Miss Mary Hamlet. She's going to be serving as our moderator. So I will introduce her first. First of all, I apologize. Let me introduce myself. Kimberly Mitchell. I am the administrator of the Homeless and Special Needs Department. Our department, we have several grant funds that we administer on behalf of the federal government through the city of Memphis. And so I serve in that role, and that's why we're here. So let's start with our panel. The very first person is Miss Mary Hamlet. She's a fellow native Memphian from Memphis, and her mission, of course, is to help and make Memphis a very great place to live. And I think that that's an awesome mission. And she is serving right now as the Vice President of Family Programs with Metropolitan Interfaith Association. And she's been doing a fantastic job. She's one of our partners that we work with that serves our homeless community. So we thank her very much for that. Next person we have is Miss Catherine Howell. She is an associate professor of urban and regional planning in the Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University. So we welcome her this morning, and she's going to give us her perspective from an overall standpoint in dealing with evictions, whether you're in Virginia or whether you're here in Memphis. And so our last person that we're going to introduce is Kelsey Johnson. Kelsey Johnson is the Executive Director of Hospitality Hub, and he's been working for well over working to address homelessness with our men and women. And I know that Hospitality Hub is working on expanding their services. And so we definitely look forward to that. And they have a unique perspective. They do a lot of street outreach, especially in the downtown community area. And so we look forward to hearing from him on this morning. So with that being said, I will turn it over to Mary Hamlet, our moderator.
Thank you, Kim. Pleasure working with you as well. Okay, we got a little feedback, but good morning to the panelists. I'm so pleased to be a part of this. I want to start by thanking Dr. Howell again for being with us this morning. And I'm going to begin by asking several questions that will be aimed at helping us get some insight on the work you do in Richmond and various issues related to evictions, homelessness, and other challenges faced by many of our fellow citizens who are living on the margin. My first question is, please give us a big picture background of how things connect as far as homelessness and evictions due to our communities, and what this does to our communities and how these scenarios play out. So
Yes, thank
long
you.
question, long question.
What was that?
I said that was kind of long question, so let
No,
me
it's
know.
a great question, and it's that's kind of what I can do. I can frame it out, and then I'm going to leave it to the experts here who know more about what's going on in Memphis. So I think it's one of the things that we think about. In addition to being a professor, I am the co-director of the RBA Eviction Lab, which is based in Richmond, Virginia. And so we've been kind of looking at these issues and thinking a lot about it. And so I think the first thing to say is that we often think about eviction as this kind of moment in time, right? Because when we walk around, we see folks on the stuff on the sidewalk, or the marshals coming and taking people out, and that really is just kind of one moment. But we really look at eviction as the result of things like rent burden and income instability, housing quality problems, domestic violence, constrained housing choices. But we also look at it as a cause of housing instability and homelessness, absenteeism from work and school, education and behavioral issues, mental and physical health challenges. And so there's sort of like cause and results. And these are things that not only start, they start long before the moment things end up on the street, but they last long after. But the third way that we think about this is as an indicator of larger issues in our system, of inequality, systemic racism, imbalances in the housing market. And so, we can say like, eviction's this one bad day, one medical bill really trashes your budget. But this is really built up over a long period of time. And so that's kind of the first piece to think about. And so, if you think about that, okay, well, we've got this big picture piece of result, cause, and indicator. I'm a professor. This is the way I do things, right? Oh, that's weird. But the other thing is to think about is that how does this mean, how do we get from this kind of big conceptual idea to homelessness? And that is because the housing market is incredibly segmented. And by that I mean, right, all things being equal, if everyone had the same income, we would still have very different access to housing, right? So there's kind of the first cut, which is things like discrimination, which we still see in our housing market based on race, gender, sexual orientation, family structure, origin, like where are you from? So that kind of starts that out, and already we've differentiated what we have access to. And then in the next bucket of housing, once you get past that, you have things like criminal history, rental history, and your source of income. So do you have a voucher, for example? And in many places, it is still legal to discriminate based on having a voucher. And throughout all of this, right, then you get closer into credit and income and how much time you have. But one of these big pieces, I said rental history, and that means eviction. And so as you get into smaller and smaller options for housing, the housing quality tends to get poorer and poorer until eventually you can't actually access housing, because it is completely legal to say, I won't rent to anybody who has had an eviction on their record. And so that automatically puts people, even if they have the money for the security deposit, which may or may not be the case, even if you've got the income for your rent, if a landlord won't let you in because you've been evicted once, that one bad day stretches for a very, very long time. And so we see in Richmond, we see a lot of folks who are ending up in extended stay hotels. Even though they've got the income to go somewhere else, they're now paying more in rent per month because extended stay hotels tend to be more expensive, at least in the Richmond area. We see folks going into homelessness or doubling up with family, right? Because we know the definition of homelessness varies, but it can be anything from basically just not having a fixed address. I'm speaking to the choir here, so apologies for that. But right, if you think about homelessness in this broad way, people are ending up doubling up. They're ending up in shelter. They're ending up in extended stays, and some are ending up on the streets, right? And so all of those things, right, that's the connection, right? Is that ultimately, as you have more and more constraints on your housing, so if you take somebody who has had an eviction, we know that African Americans, particularly female-headed households and those with children, have harder time finding housing because landlords find other people to rent to somehow. Or they have a voucher, or they have poor credit, or the cops have been called one too many times for a domestic violence complaint. That reduces the number of units that are available to you, and ultimately we find folks that are falling into homelessness for those reasons. So I guess I'll leave it there and see if that answered the question you were asking, Mary.
Yes, excellent job. The first follow-up question is, as you mentioned before, evictions follow tenants around as far as being able to find future housing. How does that look based on your experience? You started to touch on that in your previous comments, but if you'd like to shed a little more light, even some examples, pointed examples, that would be helpful.
All right, so when you go to, as we all know, we go to apply for a rental unit, landlords checking the background, right? They know a lot about tenants. Landlords know everything about the tenants by the time they come in there. You know very little about your landlord. And so eviction is one of those things that can follow you for many, many years. And somebody, when we did an interview, we do interviews with tenants all the time, trying to get a better sense of kind of the lived experience of experiencing eviction. And one woman said, it's like having a criminal record. It's worse than a criminal record. Because we don't do blanket bans on criminal records anymore, but it's totally okay to ban on evictions. And what we find, and what a lot of research has found, is that Black women, particularly Black women with children, are disproportionately impacted by this. Those who are going through eviction are disproportionately Black women and Black women with children. So we're talking about families that are really getting sort of constantly upheavaled, right? Like it's really tough to do schoolwork when you don't have a fixed address, or when you're moving, or when there's the threat of eviction, even the threat of eviction. And I think something else really, as a sideline to that, that I think is really important in this conversation is that even if you aren't going through a formal eviction process, we see a lot of people who are sort of in the informal eviction space. So in Richmond, our point in time count, folks asked about whether a household's been evicted in the previous year, and if they went through a legal process to be evicted. And we found that a quarter of our homeless had been evicted in the previous year. And of those, 35% had been evicted without a legal process. The landlord kicked them out, the landlord threatened, stopped providing services, any number of ways that they can be evicted that way. And so that means we're also undercounting our eviction numbers. With astronomical as they are in Richmond, right? Richmond has an 11% eviction rate. We're still undercounting. And so I think that's an important piece to talk about in terms of those connections as well.
Thank you for that insight. And that kind of explains the people who either virtually or previously physically walked into our offices in MIFA, that the demographics are not just unique to Memphis. So thank you for that. The next one is I'm going to ask you for your an abstract perspective on housing. What are your overall thoughts about the state of housing in America, and even more specifically in your neck of the woods in Richmond, Virginia?
Oh man, I feel like it's too early to start out with something like that. Like, I hope folks have had coffee. So I think that we know a lot of data, and I think particularly in the South, we have an affordable housing problem. And it's not just that we don't have enough units that are subsidized, although that is a big problem. We have an underinvestment in affordable housing. But we also have those that may be affordable because not through subsidy, but through because they're just in neighborhoods that are they have more challenges or have depressed markets. We're also seeing housing quality challenges. So folks are maybe finding housing that's affordable to them, but they're living in units that are high, that have really major deficiencies in terms of air quality, for example, in terms of mold, lead, and other sorts of really major environmental challenges. And then beyond that, there's questions of accessibility for those with limited mobility and other challenges like that, right? Yes, this housing quality. I'm watching the chat and it's like, yes, high energy burden questions, right? So that's something sort of globally within the South that we're seeing. In Richmond specifically, we see that really highly, right? We have a really high rent burden, which means that folks are paying more than 30% of their income for rent and utilities. We see very few units available. I think we have like 30 units per 100 people who need them at the 0 to 30% range, and it's only slightly higher for those below 50% of area median income. So that's the population that is most precarious in terms of falling into homelessness. And so if our biggest producer of affordable housing is the low-income housing tax credit, which is fantastic, except that it subsidizes at 60% of the area median income, which is over cost for most of the households that really need it. And so we really have kind of a mismatch between what subsidy streams are available and the households that need them.
That is unfortunate. We got to figure out how to lessen that gap. All right, so a term that I knew previous that related to mathematics and statistics is also used when we look at homelessness. It's called compounding. Can you tell us what factors make addressing homelessness even more difficult when we look at the term compounding?
I think this is the thing. We love quick fixes, right? Like that's the best. If you can find the one thing that solves the problem, you're like, nailed it, got this, I'm good, right? But unfortunately, with housing, there are compounding factors all the time, and most of them are completely external to the family. So it could be, so right now we're in the midst of COVID, and I was just writing about this, that you have families that were already living in precarious situations from a budget standpoint, right? They could just afford the budget, and that was good. And then, their hours got cut. Maybe the job didn't get lost, but the hours got cut. And so that really tenuous little budget ends up being a little bit shaken. And then someone in the family gets COVID, because this is the same communities that are being impacted by job loss, are also frontline workers. They are most impacted and likely to be most impacted because of compounding historical factors around housing quality, neighborhood quality, air quality issues, et cetera, food access, are most likely to be impacted by COVID as well. And so, that's just right in this moment, right? But these are sort of compounding factors that kind of layer on and ultimately make families more unstable and less able to continue paying rent, paying utilities, and they're making tough choices. And they always make tough choices. You talk to somebody who's been facing housing insecurity for a long time, and they talk about, well, I know they won't cut off my utilities in the winter, but my landlord might evict me. So I pay my rent first, and then I pay my utilities. At other times, there's another interview that we had that was in the summer, and she's like, well, what am I going to do without power? They're going to cut my power off, so I couldn't pay my landlord. And so these kinds of pieces that these kinds of trade-offs people are making, they're just getting that much harder in this moment with COVID, with a high rate of eviction and unemployment.
Yeah, those are indeed impossible choices, just in my thinking. And I'm always just amazed at the resiliency of people. Kind of a broad parallel scope of how Memphis looks as compared to Richmond, Virginia, vice versa. And please include some of the dynamics you've seen since COVID hit, as you mentioned.
I can't speak much to Memphis, but I can speak a lot to Richmond. And from our conversation when we prepped for this panel, it sounded like things were very similar. So when we started to map COVID rates, unemployment insurance claims, and eviction filings, the neighborhoods were just smack on top of each other. And conversely, the same neighborhoods that have been protected from evictions, right? I'll back up a minute, but we did an analysis 2 years ago of neighborhood eviction rates and neighborhood racial composition. And we found more than any other factor, like by double, race, not income, not housing value, not anything else, was the strongest predictor of neighborhood eviction rates. And so, in fact, neighborhoods of color you see as the percentage of Black or Latinx households increased, eviction rates went up. As the number of white households increased, the eviction rate went down. Now, it's not because a landlord's looking at two households and saying, you're in, you're out. The fact is the landlord never has two households that are of different races because our neighborhoods are so segregated. Now, fast forward to COVID. We're seeing, right, this is the same impact. So we're seeing the overlay of, we put COVID on the map on top of our eviction maps, and they're the same neighborhoods. And these are the same neighborhoods also that, quite frankly, were redlined in the mid-century. They faced destruction from urban renewal. I mean, in Richmond, highways were the preferred destruction mechanism where you could play connect the dots with Black neighborhoods in Richmond, and they were destroyed and bisected through highway construction. These were the same neighborhoods that were hit by foreclosure in the late 2000s, and now they're being hit by eviction and COVID. And so what we see is this kind of like pattern of neighborhood upheaval. We like to talk about what people like to talk about intergenerational poverty, but the fact is we have intergenerational upheaval that is actually causing really huge issues for families, and the inability to kind of, every time you get yourself together, the rug gets pulled out from under you again, either as a household or as a community.
Thank you. You know, although the numbers are, of course, disheartening, the fact that we're at a point in our history where we can discuss these things is very promising, I think. So I know you talked a lot about racial issues related to housing, but if you can share with us a little more about the racial disparity from a fair housing standpoint in Memphis, as you understand it, specifically to a city that is over 60% African American. Can't hear you. I don't know if you're muted. We can't hear you.
I am muted.
All right.
Roll
back the tape. Thank you.
I've become to be told that I'm muted. So again, I can't speak directly to the Memphis experience. I wouldn't presume to do that. I can only say that we know nationally that Black households, again, Black women with children, have a harder time finding housing across the country. And this is consistent regardless of city and regardless of income. So we have a persistent disparate impact on households of color.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I've gotten a notice and I have to show up in court. Can you share with us, or would you share with us the situation for uninformed tenants not knowing they have to show up in court? If you have any stories that you can share, the challenges that these tenants face when receiving eviction notices requiring them to show up in court.
Yeah, this is a big one. I'm really facing this now because if a tenant doesn't show up to court, they receive, at least in Virginia and I suspect Tennessee, they receive what's called a default judgment. The landlord gets the default judgment and it automatically goes to an eviction. And so like in Richmond, for example, our default judgment rate is somewhere around 70%. So that's a lot of tenants that are not showing up. And there are a lot of reasons why you wouldn't show up. For some people, it's been confusion around the various moratoria through this period. So tenants don't know. They're like, well, I can't be evicted. And they don't know that actually still the court continues. And so we've actually got the Richmond Tenants Union and some of our public interest attorneys have been really engaging and working with tenants to make sure that they know they have to show up because this is a big deal. And so community-based organizations can be really helpful in that arena. But a lot of times people don't show up because they're like, well, what's gonna matter? Why would I waste my day? I'm not gonna win. And so of like, well, why bother? I'm just gonna leave. At least I can choose where I go next. At least I'm not moving under duress. At least maybe I can use that time to go to work. among other things. And so I think that's an important piece to remember. But what we do find from New York and Philly and a couple of other cities that have a right to counsel, and it is a right to an attorney in eviction. We see that actually the eviction rates the eviction filings decrease. So the landlords are not filing as much because they know that there's going to be an attorney on the other side, which very rarely happens when you don't have a right to counsel. So that's something that they've been talking about in the state of Virginia. I don't know whether it's going to go anywhere, but what they have done is actually invested in hiring attorneys, and there's a partnership weirdly between IKEA and the state to fund more public attorneys to prevent eviction.
Right, thank you. Yeah, we have some of those resources in Memphis, and of course, we could use more.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So speaking of evictions, and I think this would fall more or less under the informal eviction category, and that's landlords not renewing leases. Can you tell us about this tactic that landlords are employing to get people out of their spaces without going to court?
Right. So some places require, there's got to be a reason why there's a non-renewal, but in most southern cities that's not the case. And so landlords will just, instead of bothering going through the eviction process, they just don't renew the lease, and so you're out. You're not being evicted officially, which means you don't have an eviction on your record, which is lucky, but you still have to go find housing in the midst of, right now, a pandemic. And so that's a big challenge. And that's a challenge everywhere. And it's definitely a very invisible challenge, because what do you report? Oh, well, I had to move because my lease was up. Well, that doesn't sound really that bad until you realize
right.
that, right? So this is a really a growing issue, especially with the length of the pandemic. Right, we're on month 8, I think, and so which is amazing that I've been sitting here looking at a screen at people for 8 months. But that does mean that we've had a lot of leases come up for renewal, and that would mean many that are not being renewed. The other side is that people are voluntarily not renewing their leases because they realize, things aren't going well. My gig job is drying up. I have this issue. I can move in with my mom. I can move in with my cousins or my friend, because at least then I know I won't have an eviction filing. And so, again, we've had 8 months. People who had just started leases in January are now we're getting to the end of their leases. If you think about that, and so that's actually causing an interesting issue within the building stock. Actually, is the issue of vacancy. And so we see, I do work in both DC and Virginia, and DC we have the data to see that in fact vacancy is on the rise. So they're hurting in some ways. They may not be very visible yet, but vacancy is an issue because of these challenges.
All right, so supply and demand may help also create some changes. Thank you so much for answering these questions. I will also ask if you have anything else you'd like to leave us with before we move on.
No, you gave me way more time to talk than I thought I would have. So,
All right. Well, thank you again. The wealth of information you shared is invaluable, and stick around for the questions at the end.
Will do.
All right. Mr. Johnson, how are you today? You are on mute. So. We're still on mute. I don't want to start questions before you're ready. Okay. We'll give him a couple minutes to rejoin. And for those of you who may not know him, this is Kelsey Johnson with the Hospitality Hub. He's their executive director. And he's joining us to give us a Memphis perspective. So,
can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you for joining us.
On my video, I was there for a long time. I didn't know what was going on. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Thanks for your father, the great work you do down at the Hospitality Hub. I have a few questions for you this morning.
Sounds great.
And All right, my first question is about illegal evictions. Landlords who are evicting tenants without going through the legal process. Can you tell us some instances you know of where this has happened, or an overall view of how often maybe this happens in Memphis?
That's one of the most popular phone calls we get is people who are about to be put out of their places. Their landlords have come to the house and left letters, slid letters on the door, knocking on the door. There's a harassment that leads people to move out of their homes, and they land with us not having been evicted from their houses. We had a man just this past week who his landlord got him to sign a notice to vacate. And so neither us nor Memphis Area Legal Service was able to help him because he signed a notice to vacate saying that he'd be out by Sunday, this past Sunday. So the landlord had no reason to go through the eviction process because he was able to coerce this young man into signing this notice to vacate. The other thing that we see happen is a landlord will come and remove the front door from the house.
Oh, gosh.
Live in a hood, you don't feel safe, of course, with no front door on your house. So you gather what you can and move out. The other thing is just strong arming a person into moving out. There has been on the, then of course courts were closed. It's been slow to try to get people to move out of an apartment. The landlords have been very creative to get people to move out. And of course, at that point, they land on our doorsteps. And if it's a family, of course, we partner with MIFA and Catholic Charities and whoever else we can to help those people at least get into a night and ultimately get placed somewhere else.
Thank you for that. I had no idea about removing doors. It's like a gangster tactic, but gosh, it's amazing. It's not in a good way. All right. My next question for you, Kelsey, is what does homelessness look like in Memphis? You get to see all demographics, from single men to single women to people with children to young adults. Can you share with us your experience around the face of homelessness?
Everyone looks like a person who can be homeless in this city. We have people who are working poor. We have women with children, especially, as Professor Howard was talking about, are, it seems, the most vulnerable when it comes to becoming homeless or on the cusp of becoming homeless, living in cars, doubling up with family members, couch surfing, and of course, that's difficult. It puts a strain on a household when you have a mother with 4 children move in with their mom, and there's a sister who has children. And with COVID, of course, makes everything look different. The loss of income, the loss of the price of toilet paper and other things going up. As you about to compound and trying to make a decision about, do I pay for gasoline for my car to get to work? Do I pay my rent? We see a lot of different people. In Memphis, about 37% of people in Memphis who are homeless are female, and there's not a lot of homeless services for females in Memphis, especially not shelters. It's a really struggle for us to try to keep women housed, sheltered, their children sheltered, while we try to find housing for them. There's so many different problems that cause a person to end up homeless. And I think generational poverty is right there at the top of the list.
Thank you. This is sad, but I know it's the real world that we're looking at. You've mentioned some of this in your previous responses, but can you just maybe outline for us what the road to homelessness looks like? How do people enter the system from your experience? And if you would like to illustrate a family in particular that stands out in your mind, and what road led them from being housed to eventual homelessness?
Well, I think that one of the fastest growing groups of people who are becoming homeless are people who are aging out of foster care. We see a lot of young people becoming homeless right now. I we often hear about giving people a second chance. In my opinion, people who grow up in foster care haven't had a first chance a lot of times. They haven't had the nurturing, the cherishing, somebody who looks at your grades and encourages you to do better, someone who encourages you to learn music and join the sports team or the debate team. And you kind of find your own way through school or ultimately drop out. And of course, y'all have heard about a pipeline from foster care. And so we see that firsthand here at the Hospitality Hub and in downtown Memphis. And of course, what we're seeing a lot of, especially since the COVID crisis started, is women and children who are forced from their homes because of domestic violence. People are very frustrated. People are angry. There's a cabin fever, and we see partners taking that frustration out on other partners. We had a woman who arrived on our doorstep yesterday. She snuck out of her house after her husband had beat her brutally. And she was scared to open her drawers to get her underwear or open the closet to get her shoes. So she left her home without underwear or shoes, just with her sleep clothes on. So when she got to us, we were able to give her some socks and some boots and a bra and get her sheltered for the night. And of course, she filed a police report, but only after she had out of the house. We see women, too many women who are sleeping in cars with their children, and they really don't know what to do or how to engage with the systems that are in place, because there are answers for that woman and her children who are sleeping in a car. And so many times they may stop at the fire department. The fire department will send them to us, or flag down a police officer. The police officer will send them to us, or go to a church and the church will send them to us. And of course, we are able to engage with them and then activate our partnerships to try to at least get those women housed until we can get them sheltered. I don't know if that answered your question or not. I can keep.
Yeah, it does, and it's excellent examples, not positive examples, unfortunately.
No.
But that's the reality. Kelsey, are there any other nuggets you care to leave us with today?
You know, also to piggyback on that same question you asked, of course, with Tennessee being a volunteer state, we have a lot of men and women who are exiting the military, and they're suffering from PTSD. They're suffering from various types of injuries, physical and mental trauma, and many times they cannot go back to the home that they left because they're not the same person who left Tennessee in the military. So, we've been very fortunate to have partnered St. Sebastian through Catholic Charities and to be able to help those people get housed, or sheltered and then housed, of course. Lots of men and women exiting prison. One of the challenges we see with both of these groups is getting them sheltered without a COVID test, and we're thankful for the partnership with Catholic Charities and the Christ community to be able to get those COVID tests streamlined, free, of course, same day tests, same day results. Wow. That paper in hand, we can get them sheltered, and we cannot be effective in getting a person into housing without first getting them sheltered. That's so important to shelter.
Yeah, COVID puts a different spin on it. So, it sounds really remarkable that you guys have been able to find the partnerships to help keep that moving along. I thank you for being here today, Kelsey, for answering the questions and for all you do each day to serve Memphis. So please stick around for the questions. We are timely. I'm so impressed. And I'm going to turn it over to, I think it's called the chat person, the chat collector, to allow us to see the questions that people are posing. I don't want to take a chance to mess up because we do have quite a few questions in the chat. So we'll start building some questions from our listeners. not, I'll do the best I can. Let's see, somebody's doing some controls. So, all right.
Sorry.
Hi there.
Ms. Hammond, what we're going to do is we're going to send them to you via direct message so that you can read them out to our panelists.
Sounds good. Okay. All right. Let's see here. Let me get started. This is on. Okay, those are just comments. Try to find some questions here.
Mary, I have a question for you.
Okay, thank you.
Including yourself. Can you hear me?
All right. Barely, Kim.
Sorry, Ms. Mitchell, we may need you to shout. Folks are having trouble hearing you on the call. They've been noting that in the chat.
Gotcha. Okay. Can you hear me a little bit better there?
Yes, a little bit better, but if you turn up a little bit more, it's gonna make it even better.
All right. Good morning, Ms. Mary. Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's better. Thank you. Now I can't hear you. Where'd you go, Kim? Okay. You don't. Okay. Hang in there with us. We're near the finish line.
All right, so just to get I'd seen in the chat, I have two questions. What is one about what do our panelists think about concentrating our efforts to address evictions, homelessness, and housing insecurity as a human rights issue? And the other question I saw logged in the chat was about resources to prevent homelessness and find further housing for those with criminal backgrounds, working with reentry programs.
Thank you.
Well, I'll jump in and say that we have always done reentry since when I got hired at the Hospitality Hub in March of 2011. Beatrice Kimmons and that group, they were always working with reentry. And one of the things we do with men and women who exit the penitentiary, even if they're living with a family member, even if they move back home with their mom or their brother, we treat them as if they're homeless. We give them all the same resources that we would a person who's sleeping on a bench. We help them get state IDs, birth certificates, access to felon-friendly employers. In addition to now we have the opportunity to give them expedited access to our work local program, which means that if you get out of prison today and come and see us, even if I have all my men and women, to go to work that day, I may throw a person on that work crew who just got out of prison so he can have some cash in his pocket for the next day or two, while we try to help that person get ID. That you can actually work with us without having an ID or a birth certificate or anything, especially for somebody who just got out of jail. If you got a jail release paper and come see me, I'm going to try to make sure you get a little bit of work while we try to get all your other documents together.
Thank you, Kelsey. Okay, so I have a question. What do you think about concentrating our efforts to address evictions, homelessness, housing insecurity as a human rights issue? It's kind of global, so jump in. Human rights issue.
I don't know if Professor Howell is still here or not.
I am.
Yes.
I get the big global issues, huh?
There you go.
I mean, I think that's a great framing, right? Because this is essentially what it is. I think, the challenge is actually from, putting my former city government hat on, right? is that when you define housing as a human right, which of course, again, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn in this group and saying that it is, it has a whole lot of implications in terms of funding and making sure that everyone does have housing. And so it's a tall order for a jurisdiction of any size to take on, because it does mean, right, if you look at the backlog I mentioned, right, you can find this out from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, what the gaps are for affordable housing. But if you think about that, okay, so does that mean that everybody who comes through your doors needs just shelter? So they get shelter for the night? Does it mean that they get permanent housing? And so I think that, yes, I think that is an important framing, because I think if we don't understand it as a human rights issue, which we've talked about all the reasons why, from domestic violence to physical health, to mental health, to jobs, to education, right, future outcomes, all of those things, it's very clear. But I think it's a tough sell. But if we can't frame it that way, then I'm not sure it's ever going to convince. I mean, if you don't believe in that as a baseline, it's going to be hard to convince folks to do any meaningful policy around it. But I think it's an important. That's how I conceptualize of housing anyway when I think about it.
Indeed, thank you. Okay, we got time for one more question. What would you say are the top 3 priorities in our community? It could be any community. These things seem to be across the board in American cities for improving the situation, either addressing gaps or policy improvements needed. So you can both answer that, or one or the other.
I'll defer to Kelsey on this to start, and if there's any time left.
All right. You with us, Kelsey? You're on mute. Well, if you don't mind, he may be like in his office helping some people, so we can, and then he can jump in.
I mean, I'll jump in and say, in terms of housing, you say the top 3 things we can do in our communities. I think a local source for affordable housing is a really critical thing that every community needs to consider. We know that since the 1980s, our federal funding has declined, and we cannot rely on federal funding to address the needs in the local community. And so that does mean a housing trust fund. It does mean emergency rental assistance and ongoing rental assistance. And I think, like, to me, that's the biggest piece of all of it, because part of the reason why we have an eviction crisis, why we have a homelessness crisis, is that we don't have enough affordable housing for very low income households. Families don't choose to move into unstable housing. They're like, oh yeah, I really want this crappy landlord that evicts 50% of the tenants every year. Nobody is saying that. What people are saying is, wow, I can afford this. Yeah. And so that's what I mean. We got to work on our supply of housing and affordability of housing.
Thank you very much. And I see Kelsey has rejoined us. Kelsey, you want to take on that question, the top 3, and then we'll end our session. Okay. You're on mute. All right. We're actually at 11:46, and our time was from 10:45 to 11:45. So thank you to everyone who joined us today. Sorry we couldn't get to more questions, but I am so appreciative of the wealth of information that was shared by Dr. Howell and Mr. Johnson. And we will say goodbye for now. Thank you, everyone. Bye.